The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head over to StarCityGames.com/sale and check out our year-end blowout and New Year's sale. From now until Sunday, January 2nd at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can save up to 90% on a select assortment of MTG singles, supplies, and sealed product. We're saying goodbye to 2021 and ringing in 2022 with some severe discounts, and you don't want to miss this one. There's no specific category this week, so you'll have to go to the page and do some shopping. So what are you waiting for? Go to StarCityGames.com/sale and check out the savings available to you today.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. Head over to coalesceapparel.shop and use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. If you want to rep the coolest Magic the Gathering themed hoodies and t-shirts or stickers, head over to coalesceapparel.shop. Maybe you want to rep our fallen friend Golos with the Tireless Pilgrim versus the Multiverse shirt, or maybe you're Wooburg Forever and you want to go with the South Beach collection. Any way you want to do it. Anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club, we got you. MTG Jam, of course. And all of the Keeping It 100 line, there for you, coalesceapparel.shop. Use gift code SCG at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 540 for the year 2021. Brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. I'll be joined once again by Ryan Saxe. Ryan, how are you?
Hey, I'm actually doing great. Y'all can find me at RC Saxe on Twitter. But I had this end of year goal that it looks like I'm gonna hit, which is having like a draft bot that I can use on Arena. So I'm very excited about that. But that has nothing to do with this podcast.
Well, hey, that's still awesome. Glad you're doing well. You remembered your Twitter handle. That's 2 weeks in a row.
Whew.
Doing really well there, and appropriate to talk about hitting an end of the year goal, because here we're doing kind of an end of year wrap up, something I refer to myself as a 2021 Cube year in review. And this is kind of a big deal because we're going to be talking about all of the set releases over the course of 2021, some cards and themes we want to highlight. And this is such a big deal because the first episode of the 540, Justin Parnell and I, it was an episode about Kaldheim. We did our top 5 cube cards from Kaldheim, and that was the first set that came out this year. So this is kind of cool. We're not at a full year of episodes, but we are tying up the end of the year that we started, and we did go the full year of set releases anyway. We started a little after Kaldheim came out, but it was like in time to talk about it.
Right. I mean, that's a nice little wrap up, like put a little bow on it, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, for however much you like end of the year reviews or New Year's resolutions, they are something that, you know, however silly or arbitrary you might think they are, it is nice to take some time to reflect, some time to plan ahead. I know particularly, I live in a state where it gets very cold here in Minnesota, and the days get very short and depressing. We just passed the winter solstice, so days are starting to get longer. So it's just a really good time of year for reflection and then for looking forward. But today we're going to focus on that first half. We're kind of going to go over every set that came out this year, talk about what that set had to offer in Cube broadly. Some sets will get and deserve more time than others. But we'll get to that in just a minute here. And then Ryan and I are going to go over both a list and kind of our metrics for how we devise these lists. But it's going to be our top 8 Cube cards, both of our individual lists for the year 2021.
Oh, yeah. Super excited for that. I mean, one of the things that's really nice that I find, at least, about reflecting on the year on Cube is it's easy to kind of like get lost in your Cube, where you just keep on like adding cards, making swaps, not really seeing how it's what's the right word, drifting over time, really. And, it can be there ends up being some cards that were like bangers a few years ago that are starting to really be the tail end, or you have remnants of an old archetype that you didn't even realize you had remnants of. It can be nice to just, not only just think about the year, but your overall Cube with respect to all the cards that you've added, and, maybe shave some things and change it in ways that make it a little bit more tight around the edges.
For sure. And some years are going to be a bigger deal than others. Some years are going to have more positive changes or even just more total changes. I was kind of thinking about that. I looked over what sets came out last year, but the point I wanted to get to was to tie this general concept to the year 2019, which was a year where a lot of really powerful Magic cards came out, but they were kind of not on the fun side of things. 2019, in many ways, for Magic is a year that lives in some amount of infamy. Definitely some negativity around a number of the cards of fire design. 2021, I think that some people have some negative sentiments about some of the cards. However, when I look at the list of sets that came out this year, and we'll get into this when we talk about some individual sets, but I think that 2021 is one of the best years for Cube ever.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it certainly gave a lot of goodies in different sets, especially, I will say, not even just, I think people get lost in just the word Cube. I feel like, you've seen so many conversations when two people are talking about Cube, but they're actually talking about totally different things. They don't know it yet.
Right.
One of the things that this year really gave was depth towards more novelty cubes and more things that branch away from your classic power. There are so many small themes or different sort of card versions of cards that made things that weren't possible previously possible. And so I really like this year for Cube as well.
Yeah, and that's something that Parnell and I have talked about previously on the podcast. It might have actually been on our first episode, but I remember that we kind of went into it about the card Mudhole, both being a rare and existing at all. And I know when a lot of people hear fire design, they have that gut reaction. They're like, Oko and Fires of Invention and all these dog shit constructed cards that ruined multiple formats. But part of fire design, or at least modern design philosophy, that I would argue does owe some to fire design, is that the rares are just generally interesting in cards that people want to play.
Oh, yeah.
You just don't really see rares in the file where you're like, why does this card exist? Like they all are cards that there is some interesting way you can conceive that somebody would want to play with this card. And that's going to lend itself both to just the good stuff cubes getting more cards from the average set, but also, like you said, this is going to be a big driver for novelty cubes because the more novel concepts just get more playable and interesting cards.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
But we got a lot of particulars to get to. So we're going to do 2 sections here today after the intro. First, we're going to go through the 2021 set releases kind of by set, go over things broad strokes, and then we will wrap things up today with those top 8 lists. We're going to take our first break and we'll be back to talk about the sets that came out to impact Cube in 2021.
Look, we're all Magic players here, so I know you're probably like me. And you have some extra cards that are hanging around that you would love to sell for cash or maybe trade in for some more cards. Well, if you're looking to sell or trade your Magic the Gathering cards, it has literally never been easier. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell with a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry. There is no reason to sell to anybody else. We have 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. 1, check out our buy list. You can find out exactly what we're paying for each of your cards individually right now. That too much work? Number 2, check out our ship and sell program. Put your cards in a box, tape it up, send it to us. We'll do the rest of the work. Or if you're passing through Roanoke, Virginia, come visit Star City Comics and Games, and we can sit down with a buyer and work out a trade right there in the store. Or if you might be a store and you're looking to offload bulk and you have over 500,000 cards you're looking to sell, we can come to you. Any of the ways that you want to work with us, go to starcitygames.com/sell. That's SELL right now for more information.
All right, welcome back. It is time to talk about the sets that came out in the year 2021 and their broad impact, what those sets mean for designing and playing Magic the Gathering cubes. We mentioned this one by name already at the top of the show. The first set released this year, it's going to be Kaldheim. And this set does actually have a pretty nice long list of cube bangers in terms of individual cards. The card that actually really jumps out to me, and part of why it does, because I think it's kind of a crime that it's not in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, and really belongs in way more cubes, like a high volume of cubes, I think should just play the card Clarion Spirit. But
sure,
maybe that's a topic for another day. But the broad themes, Kaldheim had a big snow comeback, a number of Snow Matters cards. Not a lot of them actually very powerful. It's kind of a funny thing about snow is only a couple cards break through. That's usually enough for us to be aware of them for Constructed. On the podcast previously, we did do an episode on snow, and that's kind of an observation we made. There's like just so many total cards. And there is a range of just limited filler, worse than limited filler, and then like Constructed staple. So they can be kind of funny to review there. And then I think the other big thing that really stands out for Kaldheim, maybe it stands out more when you think of it in the context of preview season, but I can't think of Kaldheim without thinking of the foretell mechanic.
Sure.
And a big part of that is people losing their minds about specifically the card Doomscar, which that might actually be the most overhyped card of the year in like all of Magic. Because I think a lot of people were expecting that to be this sweeper that you can cast on turn 3. It was just going to turn control versus aggro on his head. It's like, actually, that card just costs 5 a lot of time, and that really sucks.
Yeah, I mean, it technically costs 5 all the time.
That's true. 2 and then 3 is still 5.
Yeah, and I think that there's like something that I about the foretell mechanic that I thought was cool at first, but then it's aptly named. I'll put it that way. You know, there are only so many foretell cards that you're really going to have. And so, you know, whether or not knowing that your opponent has a 3-mana Wrath in their deck, but knowing whether or not it's plausible they can cast it on turn 3 is a big difference.
Definitely. And for my money, I actually do like foretell in cube if you have a bit of a foretell package, because I think it is important to play that guessing game, because if you just put Doomscar in your cube because it's a good card, when it's face up, it's a lot less good.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, having the guessing game with like Saw It Coming and those other spells makes it way more compelling.
Yeah, it's the same thing with Morph, really, right? Like the more morphs you have in your cube, the more compelling each of those individual cards are. But once you get down to like one morph, it's a little less enticing.
It is literally always Willbender. Or rather, it'd probably be Den Protector, but
yeah.
There's a handful of just objectively powerful individual cards from Kaldheim. We'll see if any of those make that onto either or both of our top 8 list. I know Standard has been dominated largely by Alrund's Epiphany as of late. That's a very solid card. Asika's Chariot gets a lot of buzz from this set. Anything else come to mind for you when we talk about Kaldheim in terms of cube?
Yeah, I mean, really, I think what Kaldheim brought, as I mentioned sort of at the beginning of this episode, related to sort of not necessarily novelty cubes, but the fetchable snow duels.
At Common, right? Too.
Yeah, at Common is like it was a pretty big deal, I think, for at least a lot of cubes. And I think we mentioned it. I don't remember if it was a Singleton episode, but something like, for me, I tried having all of my basics be basics, and it made me feel icky. I don't know, it made me feel icky. But there, do you know the card? There's exactly one card in Magic's history that makes me want to have all snow basics. Do you know what that card is?
I want to make a guess because it's the first card that excites me when I think about snow, but I would be surprised if it's your card. But the card for me is Mouth of Ronom.
No, it's Icehide Golem.
Ooh,
not the most exciting card, but just
it's more exciting than Mouth of Ronom.
I really love the idea of, give me a colorless, 2/2, like 1 mana artifact 2/2. It's actually really exciting to me, just given the different dynamics that it can play. In Cube, I have probably sideboarded in Goblin Guide in blue-red control more than most people, just to trade with an aggro creature.
Yeah.
And so having that be a tool for many decks, as well as like decks that can be excited for it, like Tinker decks, Artifact decks, be a colorless 1-drop for any aggro deck, also bolsters the efficacy of 2-color aggro, even. Although maybe it actually secretly doesn't because you can't cast it off of your dual lands. So
right.
I'm not exactly sure. Cards that have been on like my wish list for Cube. This one, I want basically a black-white hybrid 2/1 that is a changeling. So it's both a zombie and a human. That card would make me lose my mind.
I'm sold. I'm there.
But
Spooky Cube staple.
so that card, Icehide Golem, is the one that made me test out actually snow in my cube, which was really exciting. And anything that sort of like helps get that density or reason there, or if you have any reason to go for snow, Kaldheim brings a lot. But yeah, I think that land cycle for like pauper cubes that want to have a snow thing is a big deal.
It's funny because, again, Kaldheim does have a number of exciting cube cards. The snow card that I actually started playing in cube this year and have come to quite like is not from Kaldheim. It's Icefang Kotal. That's the snow card that I cube with a good amount. But so Modern Horizons tends to make things better.
Yeah, it does. But do you play Quaddle without any snow basics?
We just count the rule that the basics
count as snow basics.
Yeah, and I literally put snow basics in the box, but I think that's something that a lot of people would intuit, at least people who have cubed, a good, more experienced cubers, or at least ask the question. I haven't seen any snow basics in these packs. What's going on?
Right.
But yeah, and part of that is when it comes to a lot of other color pairs, there's like a range of gold cards that are compelling from top to bottom. Interesting effects. Simic, it's like unplayable or Oko, and the cards in between are like pretty rare, and many of them are pretty bad. And Icefang is just
Uro now.
Yeah, that one could be really fun too.
It's so much fun.
I hate Uro. I actually there's no reason to get into this. I hate Uro and Oko. Both of them we'll just say equally.
Okay.
Uro is more forgivable in cube, but anyway. So that's Kaldheim. And then one thing about 2021 and what they're doing with sets these days, sets tend to be accompanied, I think every set, main standard release is accompanied by a commander precon or some number of commander precons. We're going to lump all those together. We're going to talk about those later. If it were the case that there was a deep pool to pull from for cube broadly from these commander decks, maybe we do it differently, but there's only so many cards from those that I actually find terribly compelling for cube outside of specifically commander cubes. So that's going to jump us up to Strixhaven School of Mages. This is a very cool set. Some deep stuff going on here. Enemy color supports. You have the 5 schools that all draw from an enemy color pair. And Lesson Learn was introduced here. We saw that in one of the Magic Arena cubes. I think that if you break Singleton, Lesson and Learn's a pretty compelling mechanic to do for that. Just so you have that Lesson Learn package. Certainly a set cube might be interested in that grindy Lesson Learn gameplay. And I love Strixhaven because Magecraft was this 5-color spells matter mechanic. And just having it so there's more stuff in all 5 colors that makes it more easy to blend archetypes and pairs of archetypes across more colors. Just makes cube draft more dynamic. So I actually really like Strixhaven. Maybe the volume of cards that are terribly exciting is not as high as I would like, but it does signal there's a little bit more spells matter in white. There's a little bit more in green with Dragon's Guard Elite kind of leading the charge there for green. Amusingly, the spells matter card for white for this year, I think, is going to be Kaldheim's Clarion Spirit. But yeah. I digress. That is a sign, it's from a different set that we're getting more of this in all 5 colors, which I like quite a lot.
Yeah, I think I sort of to echo that, Strixhaven for me had so many cards that I was initially very excited about. But when I messed around with them or thought about them more or talked to people, it just almost all of them fell just a little bit flat, at least for my classic cube. Plenty of them are in, my combat cube that has a Spells Matters theme. And a bunch of sort of stuff like that. I think it has sort of my favorite coupling of mechanics of the whole year, though. I mean, I love Magecraft and Lesson Learn generally. I wish Lesson Learn could be something that was more ingrained in cubes, but it's a very isolated mechanic, really.
Right.
The more, if it comes back more than once, I could see it being interested. But even then, it's hard, right? It's hard to dedicate something to a cube that plays out like Lesson Learn if you don't, as you said, break singleton or just have a bunch of them. But that was one of my favorite parts of the limited format. I thought it was really awesome that this sort of suite of commons all were these modal cards where you got to build the mode, what the modes were going to be during your draft. I thought it was extremely compelling in terms of just how the game felt. But unfortunately, I couldn't really get to integrate that into any of my cubes.
Yeah, you basically have to break singleton there. And then one thing I will say about Strixhaven, the set review, doing the cube review on the 540 for that set was horrible because the rares had too much damn text on both sides of the cards.
That was the first format where I opened a pack to draft on Magic Online and saw a card that I had never read before, like ever. Because I always do a lot of prep with my limited articles and everything for limited set, and it wasn't a card that I didn't know exist. It was definitely it was like it's like red on one side and blue on the other, and it has so much text, some rare. And I had seen I had seen the card before, but I just looked at it. And I go, during preview season, I definitely saw that card, went, nope, I'm not reading that, and went to the next one.
And some of them are really cool. I actually do like some of these cards, but some of the dual face cards from Strixhaven just had 2 sides that kind of were incoherent together and were just way too long to read. And just to dig back at Kaldheim for a second, I also haven't forgotten about you, Cosima, God of the Voyage. I don't know what you do, but I remember you exist and I will never read you.
I wanted that card to be good. I don't know what it does, but I remember reading it.
I'm happy it's not good because I haven't finished reading it yet. And that's just too much of a burden. I can't take on one more thing in my life right now.
I actually, as a fun little side, a roommate of mine. I don't live with him anymore. He's a very, very good friend of mine. I taught him how to play Magic, and we played a ton. It wasn't Strixhaven. It was before that. I think it was the, you know what? It might have been. It definitely was the introduction of War of the Spark. But where, he said to me, he was like, Ryan, Magic is fun, but there's too much text on cards, and I don't want to read them all. And he stopped playing.
You can't even fault him for that.
No, I couldn't.
Especially if it was for Strixhaven. I mean, War of the Spark, Planeswalkers with the static abilities, you see in some complexity creep. I think that Strixhaven has like the highest complexity to payoff ratio in a bad way of any set ever printed. Yeah. There's some individual cards, but like the examples I'm going to pull from, like Strixhaven just reminds me that Tackle Maggot exists.
I don't even know what that is.
Okay, so do you know what Ice Cauldron is?
No.
So I'm just trying to name some of the wordiest cards from like the very early Magic sets in the hopes that
this is why I don't know them.
Got it. Yeah. So if you knew any of these cards, you would know that they have an impossible amount of text and don't really have an effect you would ever be interested in playing with. That's the theme we're going for. You know, listeners that know Ice Cauldron or Tackle Maggot, they're in on the joke. Google those ones if you don't know them. There's no chance in hell I'm going to try to go over the Oracle text on those cards. Kind of like a Chains of Mephistopheles sort of thing, except that card you can conceive of like it being good against your opponent.
But you still probably don't know what it does after reading it.
No, I owned one of those for a short while, and yeah, I only have a approximate idea of how it works. Anyway, speaking of complex sets, we are jumping to a more complex set, or at least a comparably complex set, but this one actually has some really good payoff. That's going to be Modern Horizons 2, and this is probably just the biggest Magic release of the year, I think, for most people's money.
Yeah, I mean, this set changed everything for everyone. Like, it doesn't matter what the, like, I think Modern Horizons 2 is the best limited format probably of all time. Wow. It's fantastic, and I hope it informs limited design in the way that those things, work. It also, and I'm sure in some positive ways, in some negative ways, changed the landscape of constructed formats for sure. And for me, it fundamentally changed the way that I design my cube. I did a whole redesign, not just for Modern Horizons cards, but like the other cards that accompanied them, because of what it provided. For me, this set gave me more than I could have ever asked for. Yeah,
that's awesome. And without going into, because it sounds like this is going to be a topic that maybe is worth its full episode, but could you just give us like an elevator pitch on what you mean for Modern Horizons 2 causing a full redesign on your cube?
Sure. So basically, what Modern Horizons gets to provide that most sets don't get to provide is the intersection of powerful and efficient, right? Most of the times when we're talking about sets that are released, they're sets that are released into standard, and cards that are powerful don't also get to cost 2 mana, 3 mana. There are cards that are like good, very good at 2 and 3 mana. I mean, obviously you have exceptions that get printed like Oko and Uro, right? But generally speaking, you just don't get such a density of efficient answers and threats. Mm-hmm. And what that basically does, once you get a lot of them, it did sort of 2 things to my cube environment. One is it almost reinvigorated mid-range decks. Because like Jund started to appear in my cube again, in very, very interesting ways because of Ragavan and Dragon's Rage Channeler getting to pair with Tarmogoyf, and you end up getting Grist and all of these like really cheap, efficient cards. Again, Unholy Heat is a 1 mana answer to both creatures and planeswalkers sometimes. And so there's that. And when all of this happens, it also makes some of the more expensive cards in my cube look like they're showing a little bit more age. And so basically it required this redesign because I got to bring everything down overall in terms of their mana value, because there's this intersection of power and efficiency. That's a little bit more than an elevator pitch, but
no, it made a lot of sense. And I definitely agree when these really high power set comes out and they have all these cheap cards in both the threat and answer department. Prismatic Ending is another big standout from Modern Horizons 2 there. You just kind of make it so the average mana value of cards you want to play, when you surround these cards and to build an environment around them, just goes down. Yep. And cheap stuff, just by the nature of being able to cast it before the game ends, just has more value over replacement than more expensive stuff as a category.
Yep, and this is another reason why I think, Clarion Spirit, as you've put it, is a card that maybe a lot of people missed initially at Kaldheim. I actually didn't. I did miss it at Kaldheim, and I revisited it. I don't remember if it's in my cube now. I think it depends on how far or deep I'm in on the humans theme. But since I sort of reworked my mana value to be generally lower, again, I was already skewing low. from Modern Horizons. I really liked Clarion Spirit when I've had it in my cube for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Modern Horizons 2 also has the sort of time spiral effect where the set's allowed to use a bunch of mechanics, stuff that we've already seen. It's not sticking to a small list of stuff to make a easy to understand standard environment or a simple booster draft environment. It's allowed to push the complexity in a way that is easier to follow for more enfranchised players. You know, when you have these returning mechanics, I've been playing forever, so I see a card has modular. That part of the text is just kind of natural. And so they're allowed to do some modular cards, a little bit more text. And I will say that from Modern Horizons 2, the small package of modular creatures did a ton for the potential for artifact aggressive decks in Cube.
Oh, yeah.
That's a deck that I like really well. Often I actually play mono white, but Boros, there's a little bit for red in there in my artifact Tubert. Just the additional modular creatures. Also Zabaz, the Glimmer Wasp, that both is just Arcbound Worker, but then doubles up your modular and has some other attacks. That's a really nice tool for those decks as well. And then plenty of just pushed individual cards. It's tough to go into Modern Horizons 2 without getting really deep into Modern Horizons 2. Like our set review for this set was over 10 hours.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like you'd have to go through every single card.
Yeah, in contrast to Strixhaven, like the cards were generally exciting, but it sure took a long time to get through them.
Right.
But yeah, any other broad notes or maybe mechanics that you thought saw a good push in Modern Horizons 2 or archetypes?
I mean, generally artifacts. You mentioned it with modular, right? But we got some new cards with affinity, right? Particularly, there's the Sojourner's Companion, which is it's basically right. It has, if I'm remembering correctly, it's a 7-mana 4/4 with affinity for artifacts, but it also has artifact land cycling.
Yep, so it's Mirror Enforcer, but then it has artifact land cycling too.
Right. And then they just we got massively for any cube with an artifact theme, these, the bridges. And there were other cards with affinity, other really cool artifact cards. I think generally any cube with an artifact theme really benefited from Modern Horizons 2 as just an additional aside.
Yeah, the completion of the talisman cycle, the enemy colored talismans, also a pretty big contributor for mana and stuff archetypes. If you're into that sort of thing. Have I ever talked? I get the feeling I never talked to you about mana and stuff and my thoughts on that.
It's the first time I'm hearing that phrase, but I do understand what it means.
Yeah, it's kind of all out there in the title. Maybe that's a more a longer discussion for a different day as well. Yeah. So we'll leave it at that, and we will move along to Dungeons and Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. This set I was really excited for because I thought that we were going to see more party cards, because party was that mechanic got me drafting Zendikar Rising last year. They actually had a event where it was a Zendikar Rising quick draft on Arena this week, part of their decathlon they're running right now. And I just forced party. And I got 7 Ardent Electromancers in my deck, and it ruled.
Wow, that sounds super fun. It sounds like you can have some wild turns. I mean, that common was definitely I have some memories, fond when I'm casting it, not fond when my opponent is. Like on the draw, I'm being like, my opponent has how many creatures on board on turn 3? What?
Yep. But unlike that draft deck, Adventures in the Forgotten Realms was kind of a general miss for me. There were some cool things that we haven't seen in Magic before. I thought that dungeons were something that I would have never thought they could do. And I think it was a big design challenge. And when they unveiled the first dungeon card during preview season, I was like, oh, that looks like it works in Magic and it's something I've never seen before. But then it just turned out that very few of the cards that ventured into the dungeon had terribly efficient rates. The stuff tended to be kind of expensive. Some of it even for limited was on the expensive side.
Yeah, I think they were a little conservative surrounding it because it is, conceptually speaking, it's really powerful, right? Like,
yeah, and I definitely understand the risk of aiming too high because these cards are just legal in every Magic format then. And then like if dungeons are just a part of every Magic format in the way that a card like Oko was, you get sick of it really quickly.
Yeah, and I also think it's going to be something they're going to want to revisit. I think there's a lot of really interesting design space about, venture into the dungeon doesn't specify the dungeon. So you could technically add more dungeons, right? But once you get into the world of adding more dungeons, you definitely can't do that if the cards that currently venture into the dungeon are already too good with their current selection. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was really cool. At the beginning of that limited format, I was under the impression that venturing into the dungeon was going to be the most broken limited mechanic of all time. I mean, it's like we thought, from Lesson Learned, which was insane in Strixhaven Limited, which was effectively modal cards. This was, modal cards meets card advantage over time. And so, but it turned out to be a pretty big dud in Limited. I think that overall the venturing, I mean, it was a part of the limited format, but it wasn't this like highlight. What ended up being the highlight of that limited format was really the Rakdos treasure deck, which I think is actually something that I was pretty happy to see anyways. While Adventures in the Forgotten Realm didn't bring all that much to Cube, I think overall Treasures is a really exciting piece of cardboard for cubes. It lets you do a lot of things you wouldn't otherwise do as a sort of piece of artifact cardboard that matters, but also everybody loves playing all their multicolor cards and splashing and stuff. And so, I'm a big fan of cards like Prosperous Innkeeper.
Yes.
Like I think that card is awesome for a lot of cubes. I actually even considered it for my classic cube. It didn't make the cut, but I've been like trying to find like, is there going to be a Soul Sister that's good enough for the persist combo stuff? And like that was like close to it. I mean, I think Wily Goblin, or if I'm saying the right card, the red 1/1 that makes a treasure is like a good card. And we saw 2 or maybe even 3 cards like that as just like 2 mana pieces of cardboard. I think at least 2 of them were like reasonably efficient with other effects creatures. There's a Rakdos one, I think, that's when you use treasures to cast creatures. They enter with counters.
Legend. It's a painter. I don't remember the creatures and the person's name.
Right, but I can tell you right now, if I were to draft somebody's novelty cube or peasant cube or whatever, and I saw that Rakdos card in my pack, it would make me happy.
Definitely. Yeah, I think Prosperous Innkeeper is going to be a good fit for a lot of cubes. There's probably many people, maybe some listening, that have Innkeeper in their cube. This card sees a good amount of standard play. Just to curve Innkeeper into Sika's Chariot. So the mana acceleration, the life gain, these are things you can take advantage of in cube. This is also something, though, I think that the big issue with Adventures in Forgotten Realms is just kind of everything was played really safe.
Right.
There's a card that almost does it for me on Treasure. I do think that Treasure is a really good thing to introduce in cube. Treasure Map is actually a card that I adore.
Love that card. Absolutely
in more mid-range cubes. Heck, I would play Treasure Map in like the Moto Vintage cube in a non-zero number of my decks. And then it does scale back in a way that's not oppressive. It's just good. And there's a card that's almost there for me. I wish that Forsworn Paladin just gave you a little more. Just 1 mana, 1/1 with Menace. You can pay 2 and tap it to make a treasure. That's like a little too much.
I was so excited for that card.
Right.
Yeah, I remember I tweeted when I saw that card. I'm always so excited about black aggro cards. And that one's like playable in other places. I interrupted you. Sorry, get back to what you're saying. But I was very excited.
I was just going to explain how the last ability on the card is also disappointing, where you pay 2 and a black to give a creature +2/+0, and if you use mana from a treasure, it gets Death Touch. Like not pumping toughness and giving Death Touch is like just a combination of abilities that is, you could say, redundant, but more specifically, I just want to say it's not powerful. Like Death Touch plus high power, who cares? It's like an extra word, but not an actual extra ability. Yeah,
it only actually matters if we're talking on something like, actually a better way of putting it is it only actually matters if you're also pumping the toughness, right? Because then you get into the world where double blocks and triple blocks are bad. But like they never have to do that if you're not pumping the toughness. So this is why the Death Touch on Grave Titan actually matters more than people give it credit.
For sure. And then did you have another point about Forsworn Paladin?
No, just like I think I get really excited about black 1-mana creatures that could maybe be playable in mid-range decks. Like particularly, as I said, after Modern Horizons 2, right? Like the introduction of Ragavan, Dragon's Ridge Channeler and stuff like this, I'm like seeing my red aggro cards. I'm seeing aggro cards start, bleeding into non-aggro archetypes, right? Thraben Inspector does this really well. It's like a fantastic 1-drop for mono white, but also like just a good piece of cardboard in any white deck you play. And those cards really excite me because the more that I can provide redundancy for aggro support without it being parasitic redundancy, the better.
Yeah, for sure. And mono black aggro is an archetype that is generally not supported / not good enough for a lot of high powered cubes. And the type of card you're describing, an aggressive creature that has some utility otherwise, is likely what black needs to enter the arena there.
Right. Like I have black aggro in my cube and I adore it and I love it. And part of that's like the people that I draft my cube with also adore it and love it. So I know it gets drafted, which means it's there to stay regardless. And it does really well anyways. But, is it the highest performer in my cube? No.
Yeah. Part of your cube's black aggro deck also involves having a stomach for contamination. I will say.
I love that card. That's one of my favorite cards.
Or Contagion, rather. Is that the card?
No.
Oh, it is Contamination.
You're
Contagion's
right,
the pitch card. Got it.
Like Contamination, it makes me so happy because like one, casting that and looking at the misery on my opponent's face makes me smile. But also the other thing that makes me smile is the smile on my opponent's face when they get to like destroy me after I cast my Contamination because it doesn't do anything. Like there's two sides to that coin. And I am one of the few sickos that enjoy both of them.
I did have a lot of fun playing your cube when I beat a Contamination with a murderous red cap. But, anyway, the other thing that Adventures in Forgotten Realms did, they have a number of cards where you roll a d20. Of course, the core concept of Dungeons and Dragons, I guess core mechanic, not so much concept, but rolling a d20, a 20-sided die to determine the nature of an outcome and event. And that's just something that a lot of Magic players, we hate having the variance of the game put in our face. It has to be there, it has to be abundant, but we better not know about it.
Yeah.
And so we don't like the D20s. And many of these cards, just like the rest of the set, they played it safe with them. So even if you want to put some of the die rolling in your cube, there's only so many cards that are going to be worth consideration even there.
And they errata, right? There was like a day 0 errata because there was like an interaction of cards that went on forever. It was like, you have to sit there and roll dice for the rest of your life. I'm sorry.
So the errata it actually made it more powerful, the errata, abstractly. The issue was
choose to stop.
It was, you technically could have ended up, there's two cards. I'm going to blank on both cards' names, but
one's a pixie.
Yes, there's a pixie that lets you, to borrow the concept from D&D, you roll with advantage. So anytime you would roll a D20, you roll an additional D20 and choose which one you want to use, typically the higher number. Yeah. And there's another creature that when you attack, you roll a D20 and it's a 15 or higher, you put another copy into play. That's the printed text. You have to put another copy in the play, and then you roll again, and you had to roll again. But the errata says you may roll again. So you get to a point where you have enough dice. Statistically, you are very likely to get a lethal amounts of them after not too many successes. But the problem as printed was you would have to continue rolling dices at a very high probability.
Yeah.
That was a fun one. I forgot about that one. All right. And then that brings us to our pair of Innistrad sets. We're going to talk about those independently. The first up is Innistrad Midnight Hunt. This introduced day and night, a number of tribal elements going back to those Innistrad tribes, humans, zombies, vampires, spirits, of course, werewolves for day and night. Disturb was a mechanic we mostly saw on spirits, cards that play out of the graveyard, creatures that play out of the graveyard. Flashback came back. There's a lot going on in this set. And honestly, as a huge lover of the original Innistrad set, as a player who was disappointed at the Resonance and Shadows over Innistrad. That set flopped for me. It kind of didn't live up to my excitement and hopes for it. Innistrad Midnight Hunt was a home run for me. I love this set.
Yeah, I also really, really enjoyed the set. It brought a ton to Cube. In particular, I'll say I think the cycle of the adversaries was, it's just so good everywhere, particularly because I think many of them aren't, they almost scale down and scale up to the environment. Many of them aren't going to be too good in your modern cube, and not like there's this kind of like weird balance of cards that end up being like, they scale to somewhere linearly, right? They end up being like legacy level, and they're not good enough for powered, and they're too good for modern. And I love cards like these that don't fit that mold, in the sense that they almost and this is very common with like modular cards and cards that scale, is that their base rate is often efficient enough for you to play, but when you play it at its base rate, it's never going to be oppressive, and like it has a high ceiling, but it all comes together to just be a well-rounded card that you can almost put in any cube.
Yeah,
thought that was awesome.
Yeah, there was no way we're going to get past this set without one of us bringing up the adversary cycle.
Yeah.
Not all of them are good enough to show up in the highest power cubes, but all of them have very interesting applications. I have and will continue to cube with all of them. Right. Love those cards. And kind of like what you were saying about Modern Horizons 2, the great thing about them, and this is a point you made about them, like these are just cheap threats that you can play. At a baseline, these cards are cheap. That means higher value over replacement. There's room for more of them too, as opposed to more expensive cards. And then they will make up for when your deck needs a big effect. You can spend all your mana on them if that's what the doctor ordered. So that really rules. And then there's actually just quite a lot of individual cards that I think are very good for a wide range of cubes in Midnight Hunt. Reckless Stormseeker is a great red 3-mana threat. Malevolent Hermit is just an awesome blue card. It's cool because it's like a counterspell, but it's on the table spell pierce. It's a blue creature, which moves cubes more in the direction of creatures on the battlefield mattering. Part of the issue with blue in a lot of cubes is that it's all this stack-based interaction where it sometimes feels like the players are playing two different games. And that's a powerful card that kind of ropes you back in the other direction. I love Midnight Hunt.
It really provided a lot. I will say one of the things that generally bothers me about it is the day-night thing. Like I get it, but having both the new werewolf mechanic and the old werewolf mechanic in the same cube, it's kind of like odd for me that some of them are like, I have one werewolf that's coming in on its back, one that's coming in on its front. And, we've talked about this. I'm not huge on it. Your cube, your rules, right? But I'm not huge on sort of like errata-ing things to say, okay, well, we'll just do all of the new mechanic or all of the old mechanic or anything like that. So to me, that was like a little bit of a miss. We've also talked about this on the podcast before, but overall tracking day and night is the biggest pain because you have to keep tracking it after the card is no longer on the battlefield.
Yeah, that is going to be the one kind of serious miss for the set. Yeah. It can be really tedious if you have a lot of day and night stuff going on in your cube.
Yeah. A good example, though, of a mechanic that like really does work beautifully when you consider the fact that it was designed for digital, that you don't have to worry about that, and it's just tracked in game. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, in digital, outside of the games where I'm playing against the Gruul Werewolves deck and they have the 2-mana one, the Kessig, whatever, and I can't answer it right away.
Oh, and then you just lose.
Yeah. And they kill me on turn 4. I don't like that. But the tracking is very easy and the game is fast. So the misery is pretty minimal. But that'll bring us to our other Innistrad set, Innistrad Crimson Vow. And I really mean that when I say this is the other Innistrad set, because I think by comparison, Crimson Vow was really forgettable. And I saw more than one person bring this up. And I think that a lot of players do feel a general product fatigue, especially with Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow being released closer to each other than typical standard releases. However, I love preview season. It's like Christmas every month for me. And this set just was disappointing by comparison, is my perception of what's going on. Crimson Vow, unlike Midnight Hunt, we don't have that adversary cycle. We don't have that many things that are at great rates, at pushed rates for exciting effects. The cards that are powerful in Crimson Vow tend to have higher mana costs. And this is also reflected in the way that people have experienced and people talk about the retail booster draft environment, where it's like, yeah, my opponent cast a 4 or 5 mana 6 mana rare or mythic rare, and I lost. So, the stuff that costs a lot of mana wins the game. More at 11.
What's actually really funny about that is it was almost odd for me that one of the most what they'd call a Prince formats in a long time, one of the formats that's most dictated by the rares. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean bad, right? Plenty of people enjoy different things. For me, Crimson Vow is not my limited format. But one of the things that having so many playable rares does is it actually, in terms of replayability, if you can stomach the games that you lose to rares, and it's better if you're playing best of 3, of course, but it allows more perturbations of archetypes. There are more scenarios where you get to pack one, pick something that changes your perspective on the way that your draft should go. And you get to, if you can stay in that lane, do something on the more novel side and keeps things fresh. And that's exciting. But I will say one of the things that I found surprising is, intuitively speaking, I would expect what would be called a Prince set, a format defined by rares, to be filled with cube goodies, because there are all of these rares that are powerful enough to warp a limited environment. My intuition would say that, great, that gives me a bunch of stuff for cube. But as you put it, that's almost skewed on the high mana cost end of the spectrum. There are just a ton of these, 5, 6, 7s that really, end a game of limited. And usually, the best way to combat that in limited, right, is to be aggressive. But there's a higher density of lifelink and life gain and on playable commons in white than we've basically ever seen, which makes aggressive decks struggle in white matchups. Mm-hmm. And so it's harder to combat it that way. Regardless, because those rares are expensive, many of them don't end up fitting the bill for most cubes because, well, if we're talking, okay, sure, you're going to give me a 6 mana card that is a bomb and limited, great, but you have to now compete with my Grave Titan.
Right, exactly. And there's that green mythic rare. It's like, people lost their minds about this card and continue to. The 6 mana 4/4 with hexproof that pumps something every combat.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
it also gives all of your other permanents hexproof. But
great. Cool. It has more text. Like that card is just bonkers and limited, but it's just so disinteresting for a cube.
As a funny aside just about that card, because I think this is wild. If you look at the stats for that card, it's one of the most, it has obviously one of the highest win rate stats of any card in the set. Great. But if you look at the performance of decks that have the card that don't draw the card, they're like significantly below average. Right. It's not even just like the deck's performance are now high.
Yeah, like
right?
green kind of sucks in the set, right?
Yeah, green is the worst color. But you have like, let's say, when we're talking about stats, average is about 54% because people that track their stats are on average better. But we're talking like, if you draw this card, okay, it's a bomb. Sure, you win 65, 68, whatever percentage of the time you draw this bomb, whatever. But you would expect, maybe, okay, you don't draw it. Sure, you're around average, 54% or whatever. But it like plummets. It's like closer to 50. I don't even know if it's 49, but I remember it being pretty bad.
It'd be very funny if it was sub 50.
Yeah.
But there is a short list, and I do mean a short list of cards I really like for Crimson Vow for a cube. This was a relatively easy set to do a top 10 article for, because the considerations didn't go much beyond that. But there's a couple highlights. If you're a popper cuber, there's the 5 mana red common that's bonkers in this set. It's a 4/4 with menace that makes 2 blood tokens when it ETBs. The red Muldrifter.
Falconwrath, whatever.
Good old Falconwrath, whatever. I do apologize. I maybe should have had that written down, but that's an awesome one. I'm going to talk about another card I don't remember the name of. It's a 3 mana blue rare, 1 blue 3/1 flyer, where at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can tap a creature or ice a creature. It doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. It's like a really cool riff on Dungeon Geist, I like that card quite a bit. And the other card worth bringing up, I think that it is a big deal to talk about this card because we are just really starting to see what a big deal this card is for high-powered cubes. But Hullbreaker Horror, if you are passing that card to the Magic Online Vintage Cube, stop. Put that in all your decks. If I see that in your sideboard, I'm going to start harassing you. You're wrong. That card that is not okay. Just take some time, review what the card does. 5 blue, 7/8, flash, can't be countered. When you cast a spell, return target permanent or spell you don't control to its owner's hand. What is your opponent? What meaningful game actions can your opponent take if you have this creature under your control? And it's great to reanimate it if you get it down quickly. The game is, of course, over. That's enough to look at it for those strategies. But you can just cast this with Signets or the really broken, the Moxen, the Soul Rings, whatever. 7 is not unattainable in Vintage Cube. I see you drafting those Kozileks. You're never going to cast those. You are going to cast Hullbreaker Horror. It is bonkers in the Vintage Cube.
Yeah, it's actually something that I've been thinking about recently when I was looking at that card in my own cube and stuff. It's like I was thinking about it. I was like, if I have a blue control deck, I'd probably rather have this card than a Trenchwood Gearhulk, wouldn't I?
Oh yeah.
And it was almost that I was like, they play different roles, but then again, Trenchwood Gearhulk, it's 6 mana. That's a lot of mana. And this card definitely does end the game. I'm a big fan of castable reanimator threats that get played elsewhere. I remember I messaged someone after, almost a week after. I think it was, what it was? It must have been a few days after. It was the first time I played against Hullbreaker Horror Unlimited. And I went, did I miss this card? Did I not think about this for Cube? Because I'm looking at it and I'm like, wait a second. How do I win? But and I was envisioning, I was like, I could put power in my hands and I don't think I'd win this game. Card's great.
Yeah, a really tough one to beat. And
I guess unless you're aggressive, right? You can.
You got to get under it. It's really hard to get over. You have a window when your opponent flashes it in to kill it immediately.
Right.
When that window is over, you're in trouble. So that's going to bring us to some less mainstream releases, I guess, at least in the way that for most cubes, how you kind of approach the game, certainly the way I approach the game. But now is the time to talk about all of the Commander decks released this year. For most of these sets, there wasn't one for Modern Horizons 2, but for all these standard releases, for most of them, there were 2. It was like a pair of Commander decks. Largely, I think they're balanced against each other, play that way. And many of these have a tribal focus. Of course, the Innistrad sets, we're looking at human stuff, zombies. And then for Kaldheim, there was some tribal, I believe elves was one of the themes there. Foretell was a theme for one of the Kaldheim ones. D&D, they have a bunch of different dice you can roll. It's not just D20s. There's a little bit more going on for dungeons, but still not all that much. The big release that I would point to on this front is going to be the Strixhaven Commander release. This one was billed as Commander 2021. And there's actually 5 decks. There's one for every school. And they kind of go into what's something that's going on in this color pair. And the one that I picked up that I definitely got my money's worth on, I guess Lorehold I should call it, but I'm going to call it the Boros one. There's a few great Artifacts Matter cards. We actually saw Lochiel, and there's another white rare that we saw in the Artifact Cube, Dave McDarby's Artifact Cube, and that was just on Magic Online. But the big broad cube one, this is not the last you're going to hear me talk about this card. It was recently added to Magic Online, but Lelia the Blade Reforged.
Oh, was that this year?
That was this year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's just kind of a couple scattered Commander decks. When we do our reviews, I always make a point to just say if the theme of the Commander deck is something that it sounds like it works in your cube, certainly for this year, if you have any of these tribal themes, there are some good tribal things going on, but many of them this year are costed a little bit higher. Not a lot of it's going to be worth your time unless you specifically are working on a multiplayer / Commander cube. But specifically Strixhaven's release, the Commander 2021, I think has an above average number of hits for a 1v1 cube environment.
Sure. And Laila, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Just try that. If you haven't tried that card, try it. And if you really want to have some fun, play Tainted Pact with it and attack for 20 on turn 4.
Ooh,
it's
nice.
a blast.
Ooh, I'm going to have to incorporate that somewhere.
Tainted Pact is a card that I added, 2 years ago when Thassa's Oracle came out. And even I know some people really but one of the reasons I actually liked that gameplay with Thassa's Oracle, I had Demonic Consultation in for a while and I didn't like that. It's just way too good. But at least Tainted Pact asks you to draft in a specific way to be able to take advantage of it. But overall, it's been one of my favorite additions to my cube in the last 5 years. I think it's such a cool dynamic. It's basically Impulse in any non-mono black deck you're throwing it in for the most part. And then it adds some really cool, interesting dynamics. Laila was one of the fun ones to find.
Yeah, I'm definitely intrigued by that. It's not Demonic Tutor, but it's very good. The comparison to Impulse definitely is resonant. Yeah, that's cool. And then the last release this year, we've been seeing a bunch of arena exclusive cards. I know some people actually that keep a list on Cube Cobra, and then there are ways that you can do sort of mock drafts on some websites. But so I do have some friends that maintain cubes on Arena that they play. Typically, it's going to be a Tubert and just one other friend. The one that I know about, I have a friend that has a Arena Peasant Tubert, so the burden for common and uncommon wild cards isn't very high. Though we recently did our episode on non-sanctioned cards for Cube, and something we talked about were just the Arena exclusives, just proxy them up and put them in your paper cube. They are cards that exist in some capacity, but this year we had Jumpstart Historic Horizons, introducing a bunch of Arena exclusive cards. Alchemy just launched a bunch more of Arena exclusive cards. Most of them I have not and will not read. Despite at this point, I have played 7 total games of Alchemy as part of that decathlon event on Arena right now. I even crafted 2 unique cards. So, I wouldn't put either in my cube, but I have played with some of these.
I have to say I'm mad at you because now you've said something that's going to make me have to read all these cards.
What's that?
The idea of an Arena Tubert. I'm going to have to build one because with COVID and everything, and I'm mostly isolated, I have quite a few friends that I could easily online draft a Tubert, load the deck into Arena and just jam. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like an absolute blast. But now I have to read all of these Arena only cards that I haven't.
Listen, I'm not sorry.
You shouldn't be.
Anything that causes more inspiration for more cubes. I hope that there are at least some listeners that feel the way you feel. And through this conversation, we have brought some joy into their lives.
That's fair. I hope that joy, and obviously my own joy is going to counterbalance the misery I'm going to have reading the cards. It's probably not going to be so bad, but I'm not, I was just, it's more that I was excited that I didn't have to. That's all.
Right. Yeah. Well, there was something I didn't have to do, and now I have to do it.
Yeah.
All right. So that's kind of all the individual releases in Magic in the year 2021. Is there anything that we missed? Anything that you would like to talk about here?
I'm sure people are going to tweet at me and tell me there are things that we missed. I can't think of anything on the top of my head, though.
Yeah, I guess. Did the Walking Dead Secret Lair happen this year? If so, who cares? It doesn't really matter. So, whatever. Send your tweets to no one. So now we're going to gear up. We're going to take our last break, and then Ryan and I are going to reveal kind of our metrics and then our list of our picks for the top 8 cube cards released in 2021. We'll be right back. What's up, gamers? Taking a break from the pod to talk to you about Star City Games Premium and why, if you're not already a member, you really should become one. First of all, the price is great. Only $7.99 a month. That's less than the price of one collector booster. And for that, you get all the following. You get a 5% discount on all Magic the Gathering sealed product, including the aforementioned collector booster, a 10% discount on all Magic the Gathering singles, if that's more your speed, and as well as a 15% discount on all supplies. It's going to be your deck boxes, your binders, your sleeves. Lord knows I always need more sleeves for cubes and all the Magic cards I have lying around. And you also get free entry into some SCG Tour online events. Definitely check those out. And finally, last but certainly not least, you get exclusive access to Star City Games website content from a stable of some of the game's greatest and most entertaining minds. You know who we are. You know where to find us. Sign up for SCG Premium today at starcitygames.com/join-premium. Welcome back. It is now time for Ryan Saxe and myself to break down our metrics and our list for the top 8 cards of 4-cube released in the year 2021. My list is going to be very similar to what you have come to know from my top 10 cube card lists over on starcitygames.com, the articles that I write when every set is released, and my metrics to go into that a little bit if you haven't read those or if you just want to know a little bit more. What I am generally looking for are cubes, are cards that are powerful enough to make it into a range of cubes. This could go all the way up to the highest power cubes, but it's also important for me for them to be fun to play with in more medium power cubes. I don't need them to be, perfect. It doesn't need to be something that would show up in any kind of cube. I don't take into account rarity restrictions. There are some cards on my list that are uncommon. So it does make them more broadly cubable that you can play them in a peasant cube. But generally, I'm looking for cards that are compelling for vintage cube or more legacy cube is kind of where I aim there, that aren't miserable for cubes of a little bit lower power level. What about you, Ryan?
So I basically, I think we're on similar metrics. I'm going for, the makes it at the highest power that I can think of, but is not parasitic to that power level, except nothing made this list, but almost made the list. I'm not going to give any spoilers the second, but there was one card that I felt like was almost a slam dunk if you're supporting Reanimator. And that didn't make my list. And one of the reasons it didn't make my list is the fact that you can almost only really support that at the highest power level. And most of the cards on my list can make it into a broad range of cubes. Some of them maybe you need to be concerned about. Are they too good for my environment? I have, I know the number one on my list is probably in quite a lot. It can be in quite a lot of cubes in which it is just by far and away the best card to maybe a fault. But my list is focused on, sort of, as I said at the beginning, the intersection of efficiency and powerful. I'm going to lean towards lower costing cards over higher costing cards. And I'm going to be aiming for the highest power spectrum, but hopefully also more broadly applicable.
Yeah, you're definitely going to see lower mana values on my list as well. And so in the tradition with the 540, anytime we do these lists, Ryan and I don't know each other's lists. So they're going to be hearing these for the first time. Maybe we'll like each other's lists. Maybe we'll have some critiques. That's part of the fun of it. I'll start this show. My number 8, counting down to 1, my number 8 cube card from 2021 is Thirst for Discovery. The general improvement on Thirst for Knowledge. I actually am still a little bit floored that this card was printed. Thirst for Knowledge is just really good. I still put Thirst for Knowledge. I mean, we've seen more versions of this. I guess this is also very close to Compulsive Research. That one being a sorcery is what makes it a bit weaker. It does let you just discard any land, where Thirst for Discovery is just a basic land. But in the average Magic game, the most expendable card to have in hand, if you just have a discard outlet that's not for value, is going to be a basic land.
Yep.
So this card, just turns lands into spells. It's awesome.
I love the card, and I would say if I was still cubing with Compulsive Research, I would either add this or replace compulsive research with it. I did cut compulsive research, actually maybe even this year, which goes to show how good this card is for cubes. It doesn't make my list. And part of that reason, I don't know if you've felt this way, but I've almost felt in the last 2 years, cards that are there for the purpose of card advantage aren't cards I'm so excited about it.
I think that actually my big strike against this card is that it's blue. I was just like, who cares?
Sure.
If I cut it, there's 7 other blue cards that are very similar that will do the job.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that as well. But I mean, sort of more generally, just like the idea that, like, I don't know, cards do so much now. And a card that's like sole purpose is card advantage. I feel like there's some other way that I could use that slot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I generally agree. There's kind of a bell curve to my agreement, though, because I think that is still the case in Vintage Cube, that just being instant speed is a huge deal.
Sure.
I think that matters for a lot of blue cards relative to impacting the battlefield, because many of your best cards are going to be counter spells. Right. And so you just need a high volume of stuff to do at instant speed. This is going to be one of your best, not power card selection options. I definitely would play this in the overwhelming majority of my blue Vintage Cube decks. And then as you do get into legacy cubes, modern power level cubes, I agree. Counter spells are going to get a lot worse. It's going to be a lot more incentive to play on the battlefield. You're going to see less in the way of combo decks. So like sitting around, leaving up that instant speed interaction is less of a thing. Threats get more robust. Then you go back to something that's a lower power cube, or even something like a rarity restricted peasant cube. This is going to start being a very good card again. Right.
That reminds me. Lose Focus was this year too, right?
Yeah.
Love that card.
Thank you. Yeah. Parnell is not a believer. I appreciate you being here.
Love that card.
Nice.
All right. Well, so my number 8. Which I'm gonna be honest, I don't actually remember the name of the card, and I know I wrote down what I wrote down is not the name, and I'm sure you'll know it. I wrote down Cat Car.
Oh, Asika's Chariot.
There it is, that one. So basically, from my perspective, green 4s has been like almost a wasteland for a while. We've gotten some more this year for sure, and this card was a card that, like, originally I wasn't the most excited about. It's like a little mini Grave Titan, which is great. But I was a little worried it's not a creature for like any of the creature tutors, or specifically Pod. And Pod going from 4 to 5 or 3 to 4 can be important. So having your 4-drop not be a creature. But wow, the cards just impressed me. I think I mentioned this before. I think it was in the top 5 performing green cards when I got my just overall win rate data from Magic Online. And it's just impressed me since I've had it in the queue.
Definitely. I think that this year was huge. Like you said, 4 green 4s.
Yes.
Asika's Chariot, certainly a part of that. This is a card, I think if not for Alrund's Epiphany and now Hullbreaker Horror, this card would be a serious menace in Standard. Yep. It's still very good in the Standard. It just is playing a mid-range game that coming to a combo fight. Right. And that's where it's going to run into a little bit of trouble in higher power cubes, but it's multiple bodies for your Gaia's Cradle decks, which is awesome. I do think that similar to how the card kind of was potentially an issue for Standard, this card can be a little bit much for many lower powered cubes.
Agree.
And that's why... spoilers, the card's not going to show up on my list, but it's a very good pick for a very cubable card. Right, my number 7 is going to be Expressive Iteration. Speaking of cards that see a lot of Standard play, or rather a lot of play in Magic the Gathering decks. This one is another example of a card that scales really well with its environment. And then this actually does speak to what a card advantage card needs to do, to the point you had about Thirst for Discovery, where it doesn't impact the battlefield. That's kind of an issue when it costs 3. Expressive Iteration only costs 2, and it gives you a card that you got to play this turn. So it's a little bit cheaper. It gives you card advantage that, assuming you can play one of the cards you have a look at this turn, will mean that you're playing on the battlefield or doing something else this turn. This card is assuming you're not a popper cube, is going to be the first is it card and a lot of cube lists.
Yep. I mean, totally. I will say if you're in vintage cube, your first is it card probably deck fade.
Deck fade. Yeah.
But I do think almost this has to be one of it's pretty rare for there to be a gold card that I genuinely believe almost every cube should play. And this one I do. I was a little hesitant at first, just because, it's taking a gold slot. There are a bunch of different ways to take card advantage. I really like the modality of Is That Charm. There's only so many room for things, but card has blown me away. It's extremely powerful. It isn't on my list. I'll say now. Part of this has to do with, if you couldn't tell when we were talking about Modern Horizons overall, Modern Horizons is really going to take, I think it actually, does it take all the other, all my next 7 cards are from Modern Horizons. And one of the nice things though, is the way that I shifted my cube design after Modern Horizons to really skew lower did make Expressive Iteration even better. I have it in my cube and it's not getting cut. I don't imagine it ever getting cut, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, we're a long way from that. I do have a number of non-Modern Horizons cards if you're hopeful for that.
We got some diversity. Diversity.
But what is your number 7 then?
Yeah, and maybe, one of the reasons may have to do with, the way that we're both evaluating things. You're evaluating a little bit more flexibility for diversity in other cubes. Mm-hmm. Where for me, I view so many of these cards from Modern Horizons as just such strong slam dunks at almost any size of high-powered cubes that they just come to the forefront for me. So for me, my number 7 slot is Damn. This card, I didn't think it was real when I first saw it, if I'm being entirely honest, because if you had ever asked me if they would print hate the word strictly better, not necessarily trying to use it, but something that I would look at and go, wow, most of the time I would add this to my cube before I would add Wrath of God.
Yep.
Right? And I would. One of the things I actually love about Damn for cube is something that's like a little annoying about Wraths is they play a very specific role in adding them to cube. If you want Wraths in your environment, they are there for the white-based control deck that is often at the table, but isn't always at the table, to be able to get Wraths, right? Nobody else really wants them. And having a Wrath that like other people want is really exciting to me.
Yeah. And without getting too far into it, this is something where you can see a very small number of cards, in this case, one card having a big impact on a 180 card cube. Damn is the single card that offered the most of a shakeup when I was updating the original Tubert this year, because a big part of the design was I wanted every color to have a coherent 23 card deck. You only get 23 monocolor slots. There's only so many cards in the cube. And that meant that Wrath of God, that Damnation didn't really fit the cube. There was a huge mid-range and aggressive slant where your deck would just have to have a bunch of creatures. And sure, you can play Wrath of God in that deck. You just kind of have to play weird, and it's kind of a weird variance between games where you draw it and it's not good or you don't want it, and games where you don't draw it and it'd be your only card that's good. A lot of that stuff's very frustrating. However, I like having Supreme Verdict in the cube. Part of that is the Azorius deck. There's a lot of blue stuff that incentivizes being a pure control deck, and then you get some card draw planeswalkers, and then having a sweeper there starts to make a lot of sense. And then Damn is this card, put it in an Orzhov slot. It's just like good for black decks. And then if your white deck wants it, there it is. Damn is going to be a pairing on my list.
Yep. And honestly, the fact that it's 7 on my list is kind of wild, but
yeah, definitely. There's 6 other cards you like more than that, which is crazy. All right, my next card, my number 6 is Bloodthirsty Adversary. We've already given the adversary cycle some time here. This is the red one. The fact that this card, just a 2-mana 2/2 haste, which is already in contention with a lot of red 2 drops. And then when you use its ability, the 2 and a red, to cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, you have this 2-drop that you can just, if you were still cubing with it, replace your Goblin Dark Dwellers. Like, this is taking the slot of a 5-mana card. Like, I think this is so awesome for red decks, both aggressive and mid-range. And something that you were talking about earlier on the show was how more than most players, you do something like board in Goblin Guide against an aggressive deck. And that's something that this card does a really good job of. You're probably main decking it, but even in a deck that's trying to cast it for 5 most of the time, if you need the block, you just pay it for 2. So this really increases the dynamism of decks that play it.
Yeah. I mean, I think something that really opens the door to understand like why these modal cards are so good is something I find really useful for improving at Magic myself is asking myself, what I'll call counterfactual questions, right? If I like something like I'm looking at a card in my hand, and let's say it's got like in this case, it's like would I change this Goblin Dark Dwellers into a 2/2 haste if I could? That's literally what the card is asking you to ask. But asking those kinds of questions sort of really open the doors to understand when cards are good, when cards are bad, help you evaluate cards better. And those kinds of questions are what's made me like over time realize just how powerful modality is, particularly modality that skews to be cheaper. We've said it a million times on this episode and we'll say it again, the cheaper, the better. I mean, one of the most fundamental concepts of aggro decks is like the idea that like if your opponents die with cards in their hand, that's a form of card advantage. Yeah, it's literally card advantage. If I have 0 cards in my hand at the end of the game and my opponent has 4 or 3, I got an Ancestral Recall. It's one of the reasons why we're like Wild Mongrel is such an awesome card, right? It lets you just churn those resources into those extra sources, those extra sequences of damage. So yeah, I mean, I love all modal cards. Again, we know that's not on my list now because it's not in Modern Horizons, but I am a big fan of the card.
All right, what do you got at 6?
I have Solitude. I think overall, I actually wasn't sure how I wanted to treat. Like, I really like that whole cycle, actually, even the green one, to be honest. But overall, I was only going to probably be able to get one on my list. I read the red, the black, and the white are all pretty great. I have them all on my cube. Solitude for me takes the cake though, because I mean, having one of the things that I've almost felt that white was missing, this was a while ago, was I never wanted to play the Banisher Priests. I just didn't like them. Mm-hmm. Finally, we got Palace Jailer, which is a messed up card. But I really wanted more, creatures that are forms of interaction in white, because my white decks often want really high creature density. Like there are these weird points. I don't know if you've ever felt this way where you like have your white aggro deck, but you like just really don't even want to put the O-rings and the Journey to Nowhere and stuff in your deck. Like you have other things going on. You have equipment. Maybe you get a swords or whatever, but there almost aren't. Now we have prismatic. But so I've always wanted just more copies of white FTKs effectively. And Solitude is just by far the best of the best.
Even when I'm drafting mono white in a lot of the Magic Online cubes and I end up with an Oblivion Ring, I put it on my sideboard a lot, especially if my deck skews towards 3 for my threats. Like you can't have 3 mana answers and 3 mana threats, and like you just get really choked on your mana.
Right, but there just aren't that many. I mean, I guess now we have, my cube, at least something what I have, Path, Swords, Portable Hole now, Prismatic Vista. So there's more cheap interaction than there was before. But overall, I mean, first off, especially in a combo-oriented environment like higher powered cubes tend to be, having just more 0 mana ways of interacting, I think is a good thing. While in some environments, you could put that as a bad thing. I do think that this card could be oppressive in lower powered environments, especially like the lifelink. Have you ever like alpha'd with a mono red deck into this card yet and gotten destroyed? Because I have, and that definitely wasn't fun.
Solitude is part of the reason that I hate Modern right now, and that's the controversy. A lot of people like Modern right now. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't, but Solitude and another card in the cycle, Fury, really put the hurt on the things that I like to do.
Yep. But they have reintroduced 2 of my favorite cards. So the fact that I have Fury, Solitude, and Grief in my cube right now have reintroduced 2 of my favorite cards that I didn't have before, that now have just like some little extra interaction, which is Ephemerate and Malakir Rebirth. And I'm sure I do really like those cards. And then there are some like pretty high ceilings that you can achieve with these already. You pair good cards together, you get more. You get an exponentially greater card. So that's why Solitude's number 6 on my list.
Solitude, huge deal for powered cubes.
Yes.
One of the biggest updates to white in the Magic Online Vintage Cube of all time. If you're not playing that in literally any white deck, like even the aggressive ones play it, as Ryan was saying, because it's either a 5-mana FTK and the game goes that long, you don't have reach, you're just kind of like a mid-range beatdown deck most of the time. Or if you're really in trouble, it costs 0 and that's busted. And that comes to why I don't like Solitude. I do agree on the note that it is too good in many environments. It's very easy for it to be a 2-for-1 and the life gain. Again, it's good against everything that I like. So going to be some personal bias against that card. Then my number 5, this is going to be my lone commander card when we talked about earlier, Lelia the Blade Reforged. They don't add most of the commander stuff to Magic Online these days, just the way that the releases work. Lelia was added many months, a number of months after Commander 2021 came out, and I think part of the motivation was to put it into the Vintage Cube. And it's just a really solid 3-mana haste red threat. It's going to be in contention with some of the greatest of all time. I think it really enters the conversation with Goblin Rabble Master and Sulfuric Vortex. And not only is it like this beatdown creature, it also gives you a spell you might be able to cast every turn that makes it applicable in mid-range decks. And something Ryan was talking about earlier, specifically Tainted Pack, but that's not the only card that's going to exile cards from your deck. There's a lot of interactions you can come up with. Light Up the Stage is one that I'm pretty fond of. Just ways to grow this into a huge threat very quickly. And Lelia is maybe a little bit much in some lower powered cubes, but it is still a creature at the end of the day, attacks, blocks, dies to Doomblade. So the ceiling is not so oppressively high. In games you lose to it, it's often not going to be very different if it was Lelia or Goblin Rebel Master, but it is still powerful. The gameplay is pretty interesting, and there's a number of cool interactions with the card.
Yeah, I love that card. Honestly, it probably would have made my list over, and maybe it doesn't, over Cat Car if I had realized it had come out this year. I thought it came out the year previously. And, I don't know if I was the one who got it on Magic Online, but I definitely tried to get them to get it on Magic Online before my cube went live. I probably didn't, but I was pushing. There was a subset of cards from Commander that I was pushing pretty hard because I really liked them in my cube.
Yeah, Pest Infestation.
I did have Pest Infestation in my cube. They did have that though.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the cards that like I kept seeing. It was like one of the latest pick cards, but like it's a fantastic card. Card's great. The other card that I was actually really pushing for, I think it's called like Phyrexian Triniform. I'm not exactly. It's like
the 9-mana
no,
one?
It's not. No, it's not the Trinim. It's the other one. So there's a 9-mana 9/9 flying trample that dies into like 3 golems or something. Right. I think maybe they have flying or whatever. That's not Phyrexian Triniform. I think Phyrexian Triniform is a 9-mana 9/9 vanilla that dies into golems. This one has flying and trample, which big difference.
Yeah.
For like the welder decks and stuff.
It also has is it called Encore?
No, that's the one. The one that has Encore is the one that's vanilla.
Oh, okay.
Right. So that's Phyrexian Triniform. I don't remember what this one's called.
I'm not very versed on my 9-mana 9/9.
No. But yeah. So Leila's not on my list, but it probably would have been if I had realized it was this year. So for me, for number 5, this one actually, I don't think it really messes up with cube powers until you go like too, really low. But Ignoble Hierarch, I don't think needs much explaining. Noble Hierarch is a staple. Ignoble Hierarch gets added to that bunch of, are you playing Mana Dorks? If so, it's one of the best.
Sure. Cannot argue with that card being incredibly good in cube and good for a lot of cubes. My number 4 is going to be a green card, but it's of a different nature. And I will say And when it comes to the mana dorks, your Noble Hierarchs, Ignoble Hierarchs, Llanowar Elves, you want a high volume of it. The green card I want to talk about is a bigger value over replacement individual card.
Sure.
This card is going to perform much better than many other 3 mana cards, and that's Augur of Autumn. Your strictly different Courser of Kruphix. It's very good for your green ramp decks to be able to play lands off the top, help you get to your spells. And then if you have Coven, which Justin Parnell and I talked about this card during our set review for Midnight Hunt, it's not hard for a green ramp deck to get Coven. Ignoble Hierarch, the card you just mentioned, you have a bunch of 1 mana creatures, Llanowar Elves. There's a good clip of 0 power mana accelerants and 1 power mana accelerants. And then when you actually get into your threats, maybe you have your Seekus Chariot or you get up to a Questing Beast, the range of powers really opens up at 3 and 4 mana into different numbers than your 1 and 2 and 3 mana creatures. So having Coven is actually pretty easy unless you're getting killed by a sweeper, at which point your Planeswalkers are the only cards that matter anyway. So Augur of Autumn is just a card that really increases the churn of these ramp decks. And if we're talking about Vintage Cube, that means you have all the cheap, very good mana accelerants, and this is a great card advantage card for those decks. And if we're talking about a lower powered cube, it's not broken because you're going to have less mana acceleration. Is it going to be closer to a 3 toughness creature that's very vulnerable, that plays you some extra lands, but it's still good. So I like this card quite a lot for a range of cubes.
Yeah, I might have to try that out in my classic cube. I think part of it was I just looked at it like a worse Courser of Kruphix. I almost didn't consider I figured it would be harder to turn on, but the more that I realized, like, one of the reasons why I valued it as hard to turn on in my brain was that, like, generally when I'm thinking about my green decks, I'm thinking about my dorks and I'm thinking about my bigger things. And I think so it's like common to have a 1 and a 4, right? But the fact of the matter is this provides the 2.
Right.
Which is it's the most common slot normally, but it's the harder thing to get in the way that green decks play out in cube.
Yeah, this one is just continued to exceed my expectations as I play with it more and more.
So I also have a green 3-drop for my number 4 slot, but it's I guess it technically is a creature, but it's not. Can you guess what it is?
Grist the Hunger Tide.
Grist is one of my favorite cards that's been printed in the last year. I love because I think it's pretty rare that you end up with a card that's like, it does so many different things without feeling like it breaks anything in half. Like, this is the kind of Planeswalker that I actually don't think is too good if you were to, like, play with it in when I say lower power, I don't mean like going too low, but you throw this in a modern cube, it would be one of the better cards, but I don't think it would be, like, manipulatedly broken better, if that makes sense. And it also, I mean, it's just so cool that you can reanimate a Planeswalker, that you can pod into a Planeswalker. I mean, that's just awesome. I'm a big fan of it. It has the graveyard synergies. It protects itself, its interaction. It's everything that I've honestly wanted from a Planeswalker.
Yeah, I love this card. I feel very similarly about it. I think that even in Vintage Cube, Grist is a reason to look at playing green-black, and that's going to be one of the weaker color pairs, barring a few individual cards when you get into Vintage Cube. It's 2 non-blue colors, so it's always a hard
already
sell.
Big ask,
Yeah. And then Grist is comparable to Daretti Genius Iconoclast, which is a very powerful card, even in Vintage Cube. And that one scales in an unfun way into lower power cubes. And I will say that the -2 for Grist's ability to destroy a creature or planeswalker, that's enough loyalty where I agree the balance does translate pretty well to lower power environments, which makes this one just a huge cube home run for me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and it's, it's so funny how, like, you tweak a number just a tiny bit and it just massively changes a card.
Right.
And so when I was saying before, how I was saying how, like, some cards just, like, kind of linearly scale, where they're, like, at some point, and below that point they're kind of a problem, above that point they're not good enough. And certain planeswalkers are actually a card type that doesn't work in that way, particularly because the dynamics of cubes, as you increase in power level, often the importance of combat decreases, which inherently increases the expected number of turns a planeswalker is going to sit on the board. It's why, like, if you were to draw, like, in combo oriented or in some even versions of Vintage Cube, Ashiok, the 3-mana one, can actually feel pretty oppressive. But if you throw that Ashiok in a lower powered cube, it's actually going to perform pretty terribly. Terribly is probably over.
There's going to be more pressure for you to have blockers for it.
Right. Exactly. It's not just going to be something that you can jam. Where often in Powered Cube, you're jamming that early and it's not dying and it's actually threatening. And so Grist, that -2 actually goes a very long way for it not dominating, not having a dominating board presence.
Right. My number 3, card we already talked about. You had it a little lower on your list. It's Dam. Mm-hmm. Dam's awesome. What do you have at number 3?
My number 3 is Dragon's Rage Channeler. This may actually be my favorite card printed in the last year, just point blank. I have absolutely loved having this card in, I think I have it in almost every single one of my cubes. Delirium is one of my favorite mechanics of all time. I love the puzzle that it asks you to do when I can present that puzzle to my drafters in ways that is not parasitic, where all of the cards are generally playable in other spaces, but when you put them together, you end up with this cohesive plan that is better than what you could do without it. So you're asking them to jump through hoops, but you're not asking them to jump through hoops with pieces of cardboard that only go together. Dragon's Rage Channeler is an awesome card that you'll play in your mono red decks, or at least the way that mono red in my cube ends up looking. It's actually plausible to hit Delirium. I make sure to have things, like Seal of Fire and Tar Fire to just make sure that achieving Delirium is just an inch easier. And then also, I think one of the things about Dragon's Rage Channeler that I love, there's a card, it's Burning something. It's a 1 and a red for a 1/3. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, scry 1 and it gets +1/+0. It's from War of the Spark. Mm-hmm. It's a common. Anyways, that card really impressed me in that draft format. It went from a card that I thought wasn't going to be great to, I don't remember. I don't think it was the best red common. Maybe there was a really good red removal spell or something, but it was a card I really, really liked. And part of that was the scry. And the same thing kind of happened to me when I was playing with Dragon's Rage Channeler and Cube and Modern Horizons draft and whatever, was that just the act of surveilling whenever I cast a non-creature was way more powerful than I was expecting it to be. And it's 1 mana. It almost, like, the existence of it really helps bolster different kinds of red mid-range decks as well as red aggro decks. So I adore the card.
Yeah, I'm a fan of Dragon's Rage Channeler as well. I have it in several of my own cubes. That one's not going to be on my top 8 list, despite the fact that I play with it a lot, which I think in some ways highlights what a big year this was for Cube. I like giving players more tools to go for Delirium. Part of the reason I don't have it on my list is that a lot of Cube designers just kind of don't.
Right.
When you're absent that support, Dragon's Rage Channeler falls down quite a bit in terms of the red aggressive creature that you would play. It's hard to make the card bad, because it's a 1 mana creature. So I do think that it makes a lot of sense to see it so high on your list. Just does not happen to make mine.
That's fair.
My number 2, it's going to be Grist.
Yep.
Grist is one that I immediately recognized that comparison to Ready and the fact that this card was going to be a player in Vintage Cube. The pleasant surprise was that it did not turn out to be oppressive in lower power cubes. So yeah, just a great broadly playable planeswalker.
I don't think my number 2 requires much introduction. People tend to know it. It's Ragavan, if I'm pronouncing that right. I mean,
you're not.
I'm not. How do I pronounce it?
It's Ragavan.
Ragavan,
Imble Pilferer. But I have heard of this card.
Yeah, I mean, I like monkeys. That's the real reason it's here. I mean, I like saying monkey when I cast it, but it's probably the best. Is it the best 1 mana creature of all time? Might be.
I think that. I'll let you continue. I don't think it is.
Okay. overall, one of the things that I've liked about Ragavan, and I do think it is probably relatively overhyped given its performance in Constructed, and it's like pretty easy to interact with. But as I've said a few times, especially related to the conversation earlier about the black 1-drops being playable elsewhere, anytime there is a 1-mana creature that I feel is great in aggro but will see play elsewhere, I'm just as happy as I can be. Related to our conversation with Icehide Golem, right? Where that was the card that made me want to be Snow. And this is why you see, for me, Dragon's Rage Channeler and the monkey in my top 3, right? Is they're cards that do that, right? They're not just, if I red aggro cards, right? I think there was if I wanted to just add 1-mana creatures, wasn't what's it called? Wasn't Usher of the Fallen this year?
Yep. Yeah,
right.
Kaldheim.
So like Usher of the Fallen, one of the best white 1-drops, but that's not making my list, and these red ones are. And you could argue Usher of the Fallen in mono white is probably going to be better. It's definitely going to be better than Dragon's Rage Channeler in mono red. But the reason these make my top is because for me, having the ability to provide a dense support for aggro without it and making it slightly less parasitic, as well as increasing the dynamics of the draft, right? For me, I love the draft of any format always more than the gameplay. So the dynamics of the draft matter. And I just think it's more fun when it's not trivially everything for the aggro deck is going to wheel.
Right.
Right. It adds more dynamics. There's more intersection of archetypes. And so for me, these cards provide a lot more to the tools that I can use as a cube designer to provide the most cohesive and awesome experience. And, as you said, related to Dragon's Rage Channeler, not everybody has the Tarfire. But to me, Dragon's Rage Channeler is a tool that gives me, as the designer, access to say, I can put the Tarfire in. I can put the Seal of Fire in. Oh, look, Seal of Fire overlaps with Lurrus too. Mm-hmm. And that's really exciting to me. So it's not that Ragavan, I actually think it's just like a busted card. In fact, I think there's a lot of ways to make it not so busted in Cube. It's just like pretty good. But I do think it does properly end up seeing play outside of mono red, which is what excites me.
So I love playing Ragavan in Vintage Cube.
Okay.
What I like about it is much of what you highlighted, what's good about the card. I can either go into mono red aggro or more commonly in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, because mono red is not the best aggressive deck. Mono white tends to perform better. I would rather be an Izzet deck. I played a really awesome game the last run of the Vintage Cube where I cast a cryptic command with only blue mana from treasures that my turn 1 Ragavan made. Like that really got me going. I loved that. It was my cryptic command, for the record, not the opponent's. The issue I have, the conversation around Ragavan is so fucking tedious because the card's ceiling is so high and people don't even acknowledge the card's floor.
Sure.
If the card's floor, if you're playing with it in Modern, is your opponent cast a Memnite and you have like an existential crisis about what you're doing with your life because you have this Ragavan in your hand. And if you draw a second copy, you're just going to quit Magic, right? And then in Cube, it is really awesome when you hit that early hit. And there's not as much pressure towards the floor. You care more about the ceiling because 1 mana 2/1 in a singleton format, that's going to be better to have around, especially because, like you were saying, this is good in mid-range decks. But I come back again to the conversation around Ragavan, and this is where I want to tear my ears off some days. Some of my friends in my local play group that we stream a lot of games on Discord hate this card. And they play a lot of Magic. They're not going to quit, because why would you quit? But they play a lot of Modern, Legacy, the Magic Online cubes. And this is something that Mark Rosewater says about design. If you design something that nobody hates, you probably design something that nobody loves. I definitely have some of that love personally for Ragavan. I love playing with it in Vintage Cube and high-powered cube environments. And I understand a lot of other players are going to love it too. But I have to deal with just people that just lose their minds at the sight of the card. Like the opponent plays it and they're like, oh, my day and life are ruined. And I just have to hear these people talk like this. And that makes it difficult for me to enjoy the card.
I feel like
that's a very personal story.
I feel like a great way to resolve this is cast more contaminations against these people. Put it into perspective.
This is how bad you could have it. Yeah, that's a good point. Put maybe a little Chalice of the Void cube.
Oh, yeah.
So I generally agree for many people's top cube card list for 2021. Makes a lot of sense to put Rogavan very highly. The conversation around the card has really worn me out.
I
might have picked
totally
up on
empathize with that. Yeah, different things work for different people, and personal experience can ruin something for you. So,
and I think that's the big thing is that they never play with it. I think if they had a little taste of your opponent can block your Rogavan, they might change their tune. But anyway, that's a conversation for a different day with different people.
Right.
And that brings me to my number one cube card from 2021. This one might be a little surprising. I mean, if you read my articles, you probably already know it, but just following the conversation, you can tell I'm valuing this card very highly. And this is Intrepid Adversary.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I like this card so much is even if you go up to the highest powered cubes, what does white do in Magic? It attacks and blocks. Like there's planeswalkers and, there are control decks, but you can't very often get away from having white aggressive decks as part of your cube. And historically, and even still today, certainly for 540 card cubes, you're often going to be looking for creatures and some kind of pump effects, be it equipment or some kind of anthem. The fact that Intrepid Adversary is just a really well-costed 2-mana creature that ends up playing that role of anthem that can do a little bit more for you if you're flooded. It won't play in like a pure control deck, but many mid-range decks, if you're looking at stuff like Lingering Souls, suddenly this is a card that, maybe you'll cast it sometimes for 2, but having that option as a blocker, it also has lifelink. That's going to be a big deal for beating many of the aggressive decks. That also is going to show up and be this anthem later. This card is so awesome just for the texture of what white looks like in most every cube. And white is just this color that relative to the other colors, I think I might have, when we go into lower power cubes, I think that black is very good in Vintage Cube and falls off significantly when you stop playing with cards that are restricted in Vintage. So maybe I have more of a desire to see more points allotted to black cube cards, but white certainly one of the colors that could use the most help. So anytime I see a great card for cube broadly for white, that's a bigger deal for me than for the other colors.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Intrepid Adversary actually almost made my list. It's, in terms of like my top 8, it was probably 9 or 10 in the year. I love the card, particularly. I don't remember the name of the card. If you're better with names than I do, you remember the 1 white 3/1 lifelink with Exert to become a 4/4?
Glory Bound Initiate.
So I had that card in my cube for a long time, and I really loved it. I loved the dynamics of that card, both in terms of just like the way it makes like combat math complicated, but also in the amount of white mid-range decks that could use it, as well as white control decks as a sideboard tool against aggro decks. I just felt it was like a dynamic piece of cardboard. And this is something that I've said many times on this episode. I like when the cards that I have for supporting aggro are dynamic pieces of cardboard where they fill other roles. And so like a 2-mana 3/1 lifelink almost does that. And this card, having a much higher ceiling, having more, asking you more questions during the draft, have sort of like any build around aspect, anything that sort of makes you want to like make slightly different decisions to maximize the options that you have. I'm a big fan. So I do love Intrepid Adversary, although it did not make my list.
Yeah, and that's the last thing about the card. Similar note to Bloodthirsty Adversary is where you'll see a lot of aggressive decks struggle is when they get too many 3-4 more mana cost cards. And the thing I like about Intrepid Adversary is if you care about this sort of thing, you can cut a more expensive card for it to put it in your cube.
Yep.
All right, what do you got at number 1, Ryan?
All right, so I actually debated on this for a long time. This was a card that was either not going to make my top 8 or it was going to make my number 1 by miles, basically. Because I think it's the best card that's been printed in the last year by in a fundamental way. But so much so that I think it is a slam dunk for most vintage cubes, reasonable in most legacy cubes, depending on how you have things out. And any novelty cube that generally could consider it, it's just if you're looking at it for a reason, whatever reason you're choosing to look at it, because it could be interesting in your scenario, it's going to be too good. And that card would be Urza's Saga. I've loved the card in my cube. I think it does some really interesting things, particularly, again, I've said that I'm a huge fan of Delirium, and it's a land and an enchantment, which are two of the harder things to go into the graveyard, but it gets it into the graveyard very quickly, naturally, and also potentially gives you a Mishra's Bauble to put into the graveyard as well. The card basically gives you Delirium, while also just being a mana-producing land, card advantage source, and threat. Which is just when you say all of those things together, it's just, in my opinion, it's fundamentally a different game. And so I was just deciding, I was like, okay, to me, that means it's almost excluded from a lot of cubes considerations. So does it really make my top 8? And if it does make my top 8, I'm actually giving a nod to it. I should put it as number 1 because I just think it was the best card that we've seen printed in the last year by miles.
Yeah, that logic makes sense. I fall way more on the other side, probably evidenced by the card's absence on my list. This is one where when Urza's Saga first came out, every time I played against it, there'd be a moment in the game where I would say, what? Where I realized that the card just did another thing.
Yeah.
The first time I saw it make 2 constructs, I was like, oh, you can just do that in response. Oh, yikes. I was dead before, but now I'm really dead. The fact that if that's not what's going on, the sagas trigger in your main phase, so you can just use the mana from the land the turn you sacrifice it if that's what you're joked on. This card is so bonkers. I played 1 match with it and the Artifact Tubert. That was enough. Yeah, very much too good.
Tubert, right?
Very much too good. But yeah, it is an awesome addition to Vintage Cube. I do have it in the powered Grixis Tubert. And yeah, just a land you put in your deck that sometimes just wins the whole damn game.
Yeah, I was actually pretty sad. I cut it from the convoluted combo Tubert. It's a really nice piece for certain artifact KCI combos, and it tutors for combo pieces, which is awesome. But it just makes 2 constructs and kills the opponent, which is kind of out of them.
I would be comboing right now if you weren't dead.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's what I have left over.
Yeah. So that's sort of where I have a friend. I don't know if it's currently, they have a Devoid cube. I don't know if Urza's Saga is currently in it. It might be. But it's probably, if it is, it's probably the best card in that cube. And that's cubes can have best cards, and it's up to the cube designer to decide how wide that spectrum could be. Mm-hmm. But I do think, generally speaking, if you are not of the highest power, the card ends up being either too good or actually, could you conceive of a lower powered cube that supports Delirium that would love the card, but has if it's supporting Delirium, it probably has a good number of artifacts, but basically has a low enough number of it's high enough powered that the card's just not taking over every game, and a low enough artifact count that you'd still want to play it, but it's not too good. It's a lot of hoops to jump through, but I can conceive of a cube existing like that.
My barrier for playing the card is that I have 1 target. Sometimes I'll even play it if I don't. If I have a bunch of 2 mana artifacts that are going to pump the constructs and whatever. For sure. If I find something, who cares? But if we're talking about a Delirium cube, then even if I don't have other more expensive artifacts, if I have a Mishra's Bauble, I'll play it. And
you might even play it if you have no targets.
Yeah. You also might play it without any targets. It's gonna depend on context. I could see it. I think especially if you don't have too much stuff that's going to pump the constructs. You got Delirium going on and you don't have I don't know, signets and whatnot that really just make the game about that only.
Right.
The other thing about that is I think that just the presence of the card Shadow Spear often puts the card over, even if you have very little else going on. Like the life gain makes up for the fact that you just spent all that mana if it were a problem in the first place.
I've been on the fence of adding that to my cube for a long time, and I might actually pull the trigger. Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's an artifact, so like, how bad could it be? You probably won't play it too often if you're not playing Urza Saga, if you're talking about your classic cube.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, well, the thing about it, right, is it would be replacing a card that you already also don't for this. Like, basically, it is certainly worse in aggressive decks than Bone Splitter, right? Probably has slightly more variability than Bone Splitter in the sense, like, you could play it in more decks. Aggro decks can play it, mid-range decks can play it. Urza Saga decks will always play it. But I don't feel like aggro decks need to be bolstered. So then again, maybe the logic is, well, then cut Bone Splitters and add something else that's more interesting.
Yeah. Well, you ponder that.
Yes.
We talk about that some other time.
Relevant for this episode.
Well, one last note I will want to make. You were talking about cubes, of course, have a best card. I will caution that lands are the most dangerous card type to put the most power in, because they tend to be the most difficult to interact with. And also going to the other extreme there, if your solution is more stuff that destroys lands, that also can be dangerous territory. So it's not the kind of problem that you necessarily want to invite. But all the same, Urza Saga, very good in high-powered cubes. And it's going to round out our top 8 list for the most impactful cube cards of the year 2021. This has been our 2021 Cube Year in Review on the 540. Thank you for joining us all year, hopefully into the next year, and however many years we continue to want to do this, which I foresee being quite a while. But anyway, I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. You can find my articles about many things Cube on StarCityGames.com. I believe this week should be the article that I actually wrote 3 weeks ago. Had some other stuff come up in the world of Cube, but I'm pretty excited for this one. You have to go to the website to find out what it is. But I put a lot of work into this one. Ryan Saxe, where can we find you?
Hey, y'all. You can find me at RC Saxe on Twitter. And usually you can find me every Tuesday and Thursday at StarCityGames.com writing about the most recent limited format. But at the moment, Crimson Vow is kind of sort of taken its course. And so a few weeks before, once preview season really starts going for, the new Kamigawa set?
Kamigawa Neon Dynasty.
Yeah, then you'll find me back up and running on SCG. For now, just on Twitter, where you can follow me for comments on Cube, comments on the limited set. And right now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, I'm working on a bot that does the drafting and deck building for me. So that's most of my posts on Twitter at the moment.
Yeah, definitely a cool project to check out if you're into that sort of thing. A little over my head, but I was impressed at a glance looking at the decks anyway. So
yeah, I was. It's certainly overperforming my expectations at the moment. I'm pretty excited to see if I can. I'm shooting for top 10 Mythic and Limited in January using only it. We'll see if I get there.
Nice. That'd be very cool. But if you like what you heard today, subscribe to us. Subscribe to the 540 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, comment, all that sort of thing. Feed the algorithm. Thank you so much for joining us through this year, and we will see you next year.